Picture this: June 15th, 1969. A soccer stadium in San Salvador, the capital of El Salvador. 70,000 people packed into the stands. The air thick with tension, heat, and the smell of sweat. The Salvadoran national team is about to face Honduras in a World Cup qualifying match. But this isn't just a game anymore. The Honduran players look exhausted, their eyes red and hollow. They haven't slept, not because of nerves, because angry mobs surrounded their hotel all night, banging drums, throwing rocks at windows, setting off firecrackers, shouting threats. This was deliberate, psychological warfare before the first whistle even blew. The match begins. The Salvadoran crowd roars. Every touch of the ball by their team brings thunderous applause. Every Honduran possession brings a cascade of boos and jeers that shake the stadium to its foundations. The Honduran players stumble through the game like zombies. They can barely keep their eyes open. They miss passes, lose possession, fail to track runners. El Salvador dominates. The final score, 3-0. A complete humiliation for Honduras. But here's what makes this moment terrifying. As the final whistle blows, violence erupts. Not just in the stadium, across the entire city. Honduran fans are attacked in the streets. Some are beaten unconscious. Honduran immigrants, people who had lived in El Salvador for years, suddenly find their homes and businesses vandalized. Windows smashed. Doors kicked in. Families fleeing in terror. The Honduran team has to be escorted to the airport under armed guard. They leave the country, fearing for their lives. And then, less than 3 weeks later, El Salvador invades Honduras. Planes drop bombs on Honduran cities. Tanks roll across the border. Soldiers advance with rifles. The war lasts 100 hours. When the smoke clears, over 3,000 people are dead, most of them civilians. Over 100,000 are refugees. 2 countries are economically devastated, and the world remembers it by the most absurd name imaginable: the football war. But here's the truth that most people miss. This war had almost nothing to do with soccer. The soccer matches were just the spark, the fuse that lit a powder keg that had been filling for decades. This is a story about land, about immigration, about poverty, about exploitation, about media manipulation, about how easy it is to turn neighbor against neighbor when the conditions are right. This is a story about how something as beautiful and unifying as sport can become a weapon. And this is a story that almost nobody knows, even though it holds lessons that are desperately relevant today. So let's go back. Back before the riots and the bombs. Back before the matches that the world would remember. Back to understand why 2 countries that shared so much history, so much culture, so much blood, would end up trying to destroy each other. Because if we want to understand how a soccer game can kill 3,000 people, we need to understand what was really happening in Central America in the 1960s. We need to understand the invisible tensions that were building for generations, and we need to meet the people whose lives were about to be shattered by forces far beyond their control. This is the complete story of the football war, and I promise you, by the end, you'll never look at international sports the same way again. Part 1. The Powder Keg. Understanding El Salvador and Honduras. To understand how this war happened, we need to understand 2 countries, 2 small nations on the Central American Isthmus, nestled between the Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean Sea. Countries that seem similar on the surface, but were dealing with radically different pressures that would eventually explode into violence. Let's start with El Salvador, the smallest country in Central America, about the size of Massachusetts. But here's the critical detail. In 1969, El Salvador had a population of over 3 million people crammed into that tiny space. This made it the most densely populated country in the Western Hemisphere. Imagine 3 million people competing for land, for jobs, for resources, for space to simply exist in an area smaller than New Jersey. The pressure was immense, and it wasn't just about numbers. It was about who owned the land. El Salvador had one of the most unequal land distribution systems in the entire world. 14 families. That's not an exaggeration. 14 elite families controlled almost all of the fertile agricultural land in the country. They owned vast coffee plantations, sugar estates, cotton farms. They lived in luxury, while the vast majority of Salvadorans lived in crushing poverty. Landless peasants worked as laborers on these plantations, earning barely enough to survive. They had no land of their own, no way to grow their own food, no economic mobility, no hope. So what happens when you have millions of people and almost no land available for them? They look elsewhere. And right next door was Honduras. Honduras is much larger than El Salvador, about 5 times bigger. Mountains, valleys, forests, fertile lowlands. And critically, in the early 20th century, Honduras had a much smaller population. There was land available. Not great land necessarily. Not the best land, but land. Unclaimed territory, where a desperate farmer might be able to carve out a small plot, plant some crops, raise some animals, feed his family. Land that represented hope. So Salvadorans began migrating to Honduras, not as an organized government program, just individuals and families, desperate and determined, crossing the border, moving into underpopulated regions, clearing land, building homes, starting farms. This began in the early 1900s and continued for decades. By 1969, there were an estimated 300,000 Salvadorans living in Honduras. Some had been there for generations. Their children were born in Honduras. They considered themselves Honduran in everything but paperwork. They had built communities, established farms, created lives. But here's where the tension begins. Many Hondurans began to resent these immigrants. They saw Salvadorans as taking land that should belong to Hondurans. Even though much of this land had been empty, even though the Salvadorans had worked hard to make it productive, the perception grew that these foreigners were stealing Honduran resources. And this resentment was carefully cultivated by certain political groups who found it useful to have a scapegoat for Honduras's own problems. Because Honduras had problems too. Despite being larger and less densely populated, Honduras was even poorer than El Salvador in many ways. The country's economy was dominated by foreign corporations, particularly American banana companies like United Fruit Company. These corporations owned vast plantations, controlled transportation infrastructure, wielded enormous political power. They paid low wages, avoided taxes, and sent most of their profits back to the United States. Ordinary Hondurans saw their country's resources being extracted by foreigners while they remained in poverty. The irony is bitter. Hondurans resented Salvadoran immigrants for supposedly taking their land, while American corporations actually controlled huge swaths of their economy. But it's always easier to blame the poor immigrant you can see than the powerful corporation that's invisible. By the 1960s, both countries were pressure cookers. El Salvador had too many people and not enough land. Honduras had land, but economic stagnation and foreign exploitation. And caught in between were 300,000 Salvadoran immigrants who had built lives in Honduras but were increasingly seen as unwelcome outsiders. Political leaders in both countries were looking for ways to distract their populations from economic problems. And nothing distracts quite like nationalism. Nothing unifies quite like having an enemy. The stage was set. The tensions were built. All that was needed was a spark. And that spark would come in the most unexpected form. 3 soccer matches that would change everything. Part 2. The matches that lit the fuse. Soccer in Latin America is not just a sport. It's a passion that borders on religion. It's tribal identity, national pride, personal honor, and communal celebration, all rolled into one. In countries where poverty strips people of so much dignity, where political corruption makes citizens feel powerless, where economic systems seem rigged against ordinary people, soccer provides something precious. A chance to feel powerful, a chance to win, a chance to prove that your country, your people, your tribe is better than the others. This is why soccer matters so much. It's one of the few arenas where regular people feel they have a stake, where their voices matter, where they can experience collective triumph. So when El Salvador and Honduras were drawn to face each other in the qualifying rounds for the 1970 World Cup in Mexico, the sporting stakes were already enormous. The World Cup is the biggest stage in soccer, the global tournament that happens once every 4 years. For small countries like El Salvador and Honduras, qualifying for the World Cup would be a moment of immense national pride. A chance to stand on the world stage, a chance to prove themselves against the giants of the sport. Both countries desperately wanted this. The format was simple: home and away matches. If tied after 2 games, a playoff match at a neutral venue. The winner would advance, the loser would go home. Everything was on the line. The first match was scheduled for June 8, 1969, in Tegucigalpa, the capital of Honduras. The Salvadoran team arrived in Honduras to a hostile reception. This wasn't unusual in international soccer. Home crowds are supposed to be intimidating. That's part of the home field advantage. But this felt different. This felt darker. Salvadoran fans who traveled to Honduras reported harassment, threats, a sense that something ugly was brewing beneath the surface of sporting rivalry. The night before the match, the Salvadoran team checked into their hotel in Tegucigalpa. They were exhausted from travel and needed rest before the crucial game. But rest would not come. Around midnight, crowds began gathering outside the hotel. Honduran fans, hundreds of them. They banged drums. They threw rocks at the hotel windows. They set off firecrackers that sounded like gunshots. They chanted insults and threats. The noise was deafening and relentless. Every time the Salvadoran players tried to sleep, another explosion would jolt them awake. Hotel security did little to stop it. Some reports suggest police were present but made no effort to disperse the crowd. Whether this was organized or spontaneous, whether officials encouraged it or simply allowed it, the Salvadoran team spent the entire night in a state of exhausted terror. The next day, June 8th, the match took place. The Salvadoran players stumbled onto the field like walking dead. Their eyes were hollow, their movements sluggish. They had been awake for over 30 hours. Honduras took full advantage. The Honduran team played with energy and confidence. Their crowd roared support. The Salvadorans tried to compete, but their bodies betrayed them. They couldn't keep up. They made mistakes. They lost possession. Honduras scored 1 goal. That was all they needed. The final whistle blew. Honduras won, El Salvador 0. The Honduran crowd exploded in celebration. Their team had won. They had the advantage going into the second match. But then came the tragedy that would change everything. A young Salvadoran woman named Amelia Bolaños was watching the match on television in El Salvador, 18 years old, a passionate soccer fan. When Honduras scored the winning goal and the match ended in defeat for El Salvador, Amelia was devastated, overcome with despair. In a moment of intense emotional anguish, she went to her father's gun cabinet, took out a pistol, and shot herself in the heart. She died almost instantly. The next day, Amelia Bolaños became a national martyr. Salvadoran newspapers ran front-page stories about the young patriot who loved her country so much that she couldn't bear to see it defeated. Her funeral became a massive event. Thousands of people lined the streets. The Salvadoran national team attended in uniform. The president of El Salvador sent representatives. Flags flew at half-mast. Television covered it live. Amelia was proclaimed a symbol of Salvadoran pride and passion. Her death was portrayed not as a personal tragedy, not as a mental health crisis, but as a noble sacrifice for the honor of the nation. This should horrify us. An 18-year-old girl killed herself, likely suffering from depression or emotional instability, and instead of treating it as a tragedy to be mourned privately and understood with compassion, it was weaponized, turned into propaganda, used to inflame national passion. The message was clear. If this young woman cared so much about El Salvador that she would die for its honor, shouldn't all Salvadorans be willing to fight for their country's dignity? It was grotesque. It was manipulative. And it worked. The atmosphere around the second match, scheduled for June 15th in San Salvador, became poisonous. This wasn't just about soccer anymore. This was about avenging Amelia. This was about Salvadoran honor. This was about proving that El Salvador was not weak, not inferior, not to be disrespected. The media in both countries fanned the flames. Salvadoran newspapers ran editorials about Honduran barbarism. Honduran papers published stories about Salvadoran arrogance. Each side portrayed the other as brutal, uncivilized, dishonorable. The rhetoric escalated daily. When the Honduran team arrived in San Salvador for the June 15th match, they walked into a nightmare. The Salvadorans did exactly what had been done to their team in Tegucigalpa, but worse, much worse. The night before the match, massive crowds surrounded the Honduran team's hotel. But this wasn't just fans with drums. This was an orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare. Thousands of people gathered. They banged on drums and pots and pans. They set off fireworks and firecrackers that exploded like bombs. They threw rocks, bottles, and garbage at the hotel. They chanted death threats. They burned Honduran flags in the street. They screamed insults about Honduras, about Honduran mothers, about Honduran manhood. The noise was absolutely deafening. It went on all night. The Honduran players got no sleep at all. Some players later reported that they feared for their lives. They thought the mob might storm the hotel. Police were present, but made no effort to control the crowd. In fact, some witnesses reported that police were encouraging the demonstrators. The next day, June 15th, the Honduran team took the field in a state of complete exhaustion and fear. They had been awake for over 24 hours. They were traumatized. They could barely function. The Salvadoran crowd at the stadium was 70,000 strong. The noise was crushing. The hostility was palpable. When the Honduran national anthem played, the Salvadoran crowd booed and jeered so loudly that the music could barely be heard. When the Honduran flag was raised, people threw garbage at it. This was not sporting rivalry. This was hatred. The match itself was a slaughter. The Honduran team, exhausted and demoralized, fell apart. El Salvador attacked relentlessly. They scored once, then twice, then a third time. The final score was 3-0, a complete reversal of the first match. But the Salvadoran crowd wanted more than victory. They wanted humiliation. They wanted revenge. When the match ended, chaos erupted. Honduran fans in the stadium were attacked, punched, kicked, pelted with debris. They fled in terror. Outside the stadium, roaming mobs hunted for Hondurans. Any Honduran fans who had traveled to watch the match were beaten in the streets. But it didn't stop with visiting fans. Honduran immigrants who had lived in El Salvador for years, who had nothing to do with the soccer match, suddenly found themselves targets. Mobs attacked Honduran neighborhoods. They smashed windows of Honduran-owned businesses. They set fire to Honduran homes. They beat Honduran men, women, and children. The violence was indiscriminate and brutal. Police did little to stop it. The government of El Salvador issued no condemnation. Some officials openly celebrated the victory and the displays of national passion. The Honduran team had to be evacuated from the country under armed guard. They were escorted to the airport by military personnel because authorities feared they would be killed if left unprotected. As they boarded the plane to leave El Salvador, several players were in tears, not from losing the match, from fear, from the trauma of what they had experienced, from the realization that a soccer game had transformed an entire nation into a mob. The score was now 1 match each, 1-0 Honduras in the first match, 3-0 El Salvador in the second. Under the tournament rules, a third match would be needed. A playoff to be held at a neutral site. That match was scheduled for June 26th in Mexico City. Both teams would travel to Mexico to settle this once and for all. But by this point, something had fundamentally changed. This was no longer just about qualifying for the World Cup. This had become about national honor, about dignity, about power. The governments of both countries were watching closely. The media in both countries was in a frenzy. And in the background, those 300,000 Salvadoran immigrants in Honduras were becoming increasingly nervous because the mob violence in San Salvador had sent a clear message. When nationalism is inflamed, when countries turn against each other, immigrants are always the first targets. Part 3. The expulsions begin. While the world's attention focused on preparing for the third playoff match in Mexico City, something darker was unfolding in Honduras, something that would make war almost inevitable. The Honduran government, seeing an opportunity to exploit nationalist fervor and deflect from its own failures, began targeting Salvadoran immigrants. Remember, there were 300,000 Salvadorans living in Honduras. Some had been there for decades. Many were second generation, born in Honduras to Salvadoran parents. They had farms, businesses, homes, families. They were integrated into Honduran society, but legally, most of them had ambiguous status. They had never formalized their immigration status. In an era before modern immigration enforcement, this had never really mattered. People crossed borders, settled, worked, lived. Central American countries had porous borders and informal understandings. But ambiguous legal status means vulnerability. When a government wants to target a population, legal ambiguity is the perfect weapon. In the days following the June 15th match in San Salvador, Honduran officials began making inflammatory statements. They claimed Salvadoran immigrants were stealing land that belonged to Hondurans. They claimed Salvadorans were taking jobs from Honduran workers. They claimed the Salvadoran immigrants were essentially a fifth column, loyal to El Salvador rather than Honduras, potentially dangerous to Honduran security. These claims were exaggerated and often false, but they served a political purpose. They gave the Honduran government a scapegoat. They gave angry Hondurans, bitter about losing the soccer match and frustrated with their country's poverty, someone to blame. And then came the land reform law. Honduras had been under pressure from various international organizations and its own people to address land inequality. Most of Honduras's arable land was controlled by wealthy elites and foreign corporations. Millions of Hondurans were landless. The Honduran government, led by General Oswaldo López Arellano, passed a land reform law in 1962 that was supposed to redistribute land to landless Hondurans. But the law had been poorly implemented and largely ineffective. Powerful landowners resisted. Corporations used their influence to block enforcement. By 1969, very little land had actually been redistributed. But now, in June of 1969, the Honduran government saw an opportunity. They could implement the land reform law, but instead of taking land from wealthy Hondurans or powerful corporations, they would take it from the easiest targets, Salvadoran immigrants. It was politically brilliant and morally bankrupt. The government could claim they were implementing land reform, satisfying populist demands. They could claim they were defending Honduran sovereignty by removing foreign squatters. and they could avoid angering the wealthy and powerful interests that actually controlled most of the land. The Salvadoran immigrants had no political power, no advocates, no protection. The expulsions began. Honduran police and military forces, backed by civilian mobs, went into areas where Salvadoran immigrants had settled. They declared the land forfeit. They gave families hours, or sometimes just minutes, to gather their belongings and leave. Then they burned the homes. They destroyed crops. They confiscated livestock. They beat men who resisted. They terrorized families into fleeing. Thousands of Salvadorans, people who had lived in Honduras for years or even decades, were forced from their land with nothing but what they could carry. The refugee flow began. Salvadoran families, traumatized and impoverished, began streaming back across the border into El Salvador. They arrived with stories of violence, of homes burned, of everything they had worked for stolen. They told of Honduran neighbors they had known for years suddenly turning on them, of police brutality, of mobs shouting threats. These stories spread through El Salvador like wildfire. The media published them. The government amplified them. Every refugee story became evidence of Honduran barbarism. Every account of violence became justification for retaliation. By late June, the refugee flow had become a flood. Thousands of Salvadorans were crossing the border every day. The Salvadoran government, which was already dealing with overpopulation and land scarcity, suddenly had to absorb thousands of destitute refugees. These people had nowhere to go, no land to settle on in El Salvador, no jobs waiting for them. They became a humanitarian crisis. Refugee camps formed along the border. Families lived in makeshift shelters. Children went hungry. Disease spread. The situation was desperate. The Salvadoran government, led by General Fidel Sanchez Hernandez, faced a political crisis. The population was outraged by the stories of Salvadorans being brutalized in Honduras. Nationalist sentiment was at a fever pitch. The media demanded action. Opposition politicians accused the government of weakness. Military officials argued that Honduras's actions were an act of aggression against El Salvador, that every expelled Salvadoran was a victim of Honduran violence. The government faced enormous pressure to respond forcefully. Meanwhile, on June 26th, the third playoff match took place in Mexico City. Both teams traveled to the neutral site. The match was tense and brutal. Players from both sides were aggressive, committing hard fouls, getting into shoving matches. The animosity that had built up over the previous weeks was evident on the field. The game went to extra time. In the final minutes, El Salvador scored. They won 3-2. El Salvador would advance to the World Cup. Honduras was eliminated. But by this point, almost nobody cared about the World Cup. The match result was barely mentioned in the newspapers of either country. Because the real story was the refugee crisis, the growing hostility, the increasingly violent rhetoric between the two governments. Diplomatic relations were breaking down. Both countries were recalling ambassadors. Border incidents were increasing. Salvadoran refugees trying to flee were sometimes shot at by Honduran forces. Honduran border guards and Salvadoran police exchanged fire in disputed areas. Soldiers on both sides were mobilizing. The press in both countries was calling for war. And then came the propaganda. Both governments unleashed media campaigns to demonize the other. Salvadoran newspapers published atrocity stories, photos of wounded refugees, accounts of rapes and murders. Some of these stories were true. Many were exaggerated. Some were fabricated. But truth didn't matter. The goal was to inflame public opinion. Honduran media did the same. They published stories about Salvadoran aggression, about Salvadoran plots to invade Honduras, about the need to defend the homeland. They portrayed Salvadorans as thieves and criminals. Each side portrayed the other as subhuman monsters. This is how you prepare a population for war. You dehumanize the enemy. You convince your people that the other side is evil, that they started it, that war is justified, even necessary. By early July, war seemed inevitable. But before we get to the invasion, before we talk about the battles and the casualties, we need to understand the people in power who made this decision. We need to understand General Fidel Sánchez Hernández and General Oswaldo López Arellano, because these two men, more than anyone else, bear responsibility for what was about to happen. Part 4. The Men Who Chose War. In 1969, both El Salvador and Honduras were military dictatorships in all but name. Democratic institutions existed on paper, but real power rested with military officers who ruled with the backing of wealthy elites. These were not ideological dictators like the communist or fascist leaders of the mid-20th century. They were pragmatic authoritarians whose primary goals were maintaining power and enriching themselves and their supporters. They used nationalism when it served them. They suppressed dissent when it threatened them, and they were willing to go to war if war served their interests. Let's start with General Oswaldo López Arellano of Honduras. He first came to power in a coup in 1963. He ruled Honduras for several years, was briefly out of power, and then staged another coup in 1965 to reclaim the presidency. By 1969, he had been the dominant political figure in Honduras for most of the decade, but his position was increasingly unstable. Honduras's economy was struggling. The banana companies that dominated the economy were paying minimal taxes and providing few benefits to ordinary Hondurans. Poverty was widespread. There was growing unrest among workers and peasants. Opposition politicians were becoming more vocal. López Arellano needed to shore up his support. The land reform law that his government had passed was supposed to help with this. By promising to redistribute land to landless Hondurans, he could claim to be a champion of the people. But actually taking land from wealthy Hondurans or powerful corporations was politically dangerous. These were the people who supported his regime. These were the people with money and influence. So when the opportunity arose to implement land reform by taking land from Salvadoran immigrants instead, López Arellano seized it. He could look like a populist hero without threatening his actual base of support. And as tensions with El Salvador escalated, he could wrap himself in the flag. He could present himself as the defender of Honduras against foreign aggression. War, or the threat of war, is often very useful for dictators. It unifies the population. It justifies repression of dissent. It distracts from domestic problems. López Arellano may not have wanted war initially, but as the crisis escalated, he recognized its political utility. Now let's look at General Fidel Sánchez Hernández of El Salvador. He came to power in 1967 in an election that was nominally democratic but tightly controlled by the military. He represented the military establishment and the oligarchy of wealthy families who controlled El Salvador's economy. His government faced enormous challenges. El Salvador's population was growing rapidly. Land scarcity was becoming critical. There were increasing calls for land reform, but any real land reform would mean taking land from the 14 families and their allies, the very people who kept Sánchez Hernández in power. This was politically impossible. He needed a way to relieve population pressure without threatening the oligarchy. The Salvadoran immigrants in Honduras had been a useful safety valve. Hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans who couldn't find land or work in El Salvador had simply left and settled in Honduras. This reduced pressure on the Salvadoran government. But now those people were being expelled and sent back. They were returning to a country that already didn't have enough land or jobs for them. This was a crisis, and it was a crisis that could threaten the government. Masses of impoverished, displaced people are politically dangerous. They demand help. They organize. They protest. They can destabilize regimes. Sanchez Hernandez needed a solution. War provided one. If El Salvador went to war with Honduras, the government could claim to be defending Salvadoran citizens. The expelled immigrants would be framed as victims of Honduran aggression. National unity could be rallied around the flag. Opposition voices could be silenced as unpatriotic. And if El Salvador won quickly, if they could seize some territory in Honduras, perhaps Salvadoran peasants could be settled there, relieving population pressure. It was a cynical calculation. War would be costly, but it might solve more problems than it created. At the very least, it would distract from domestic issues and consolidate the government's power. Both leaders also faced pressure from their militaries. Officers on both sides were angry about border incidents. They felt humiliated by the soccer matches and the surrounding violence. They wanted to prove their strength. Military organizations have their own institutional interests. A country at peace doesn't need a large military. Budgets get cut. Officers lose prestige. But a country facing external threats needs its military. War justifies military spending, military expansion, military dominance in national politics. The generals surrounding López Arellano and Sanchez Hernandez were pushing for action. They wanted to fight. They wanted glory. They wanted to prove themselves. And then there were the economic elites, the wealthy families in both countries who controlled land, industry, and commerce. In Honduras, some elites saw the expulsion of Salvadoran immigrants as an opportunity to seize land. In El Salvador, some oligarchs saw war as a way to distract from demands for domestic land reform. If the government was fighting Honduras, peasants couldn't organize to demand redistribution of oligarch-controlled land. War serves elite interests when it diverts attention from class conflict. So you had two dictators, both facing domestic political pressures, both seeing benefits in conflict with the other country. You had militaries eager to fight. You had economic elites willing to support war if it served their interests. You had a population in both countries that had been whipped into nationalist fervor by the soccer matches and the refugee crisis. You had a media environment that amplified every grievance and every atrocity story. And you had a complete absence of strong international institutions that could mediate. The Organization of American States existed, but it was weak and slow to act. The United States, which had enormous influence in the region, was distracted by Vietnam and didn't see Central American border disputes as a priority. All of these factors came together in early July 1969. On July 14th, El Salvador severed diplomatic relations with Honduras. This is the classic final step before war. When countries break off diplomatic relations, when they recall their ambassadors, when they close their embassies, it signals that they are no longer willing to talk, that they intend to resolve disputes through force rather than negotiation. Honduras responded by mobilizing its military. El Salvador did the same. Troops moved to the border. Artillery was positioned. Aircraft were fueled and armed. Both sides issued ultimatums that they knew the other would not accept. Both sides prepared for combat. And then, on the evening of July 14, 1969, El Salvador launched its invasion. War had begun. Part 5. The 100-Hour War. The Salvadoran invasion began with an airstrike. Salvadoran Air Force planes, primarily Douglas C-47 transport aircraft converted into makeshift bombers, and North American P-51 Mustang fighters left over from World War II, crossed into Honduran airspace just after dusk on July 14th. Their targets were Honduran military installations, airfields, and government buildings in Tegucigalpa and other cities. The bombing was not particularly accurate. The Salvadoran Air Force was small and poorly equipped. Many of the bombs missed their targets and hit civilian areas instead. Houses were destroyed. Markets were hit. People died in their homes. having nothing to do with the military or the government, simply civilians unlucky enough to live near a target. Simultaneously with the airstrikes, Salvadoran ground forces crossed the border. Approximately 5 battalions, totaling several thousand troops, advanced into Honduras along multiple axes. The Salvadoran strategy was straightforward: strike hard and fast, seize territory quickly before international pressure could force a ceasefire, demonstrate military superiority, and humiliate Honduras. Ideally, capture enough land to settle some Salvadoran peasants, creating facts on the ground that would be difficult to reverse. The Salvadoran military leadership believed they could win quickly. They believed Honduras was weak and disorganized. They expected minimal resistance. They were wrong. The Honduran military, despite being caught somewhat by surprise, responded more effectively than the Salvadorans anticipated. Honduran forces, under the command of General López Arellano, who took direct control of military operations, quickly mobilized. They had some advantages. Honduras is much larger than El Salvador, with more room to maneuver. The terrain is mountainous and difficult, favoring defenders. And while the Honduran military was not large or well-equipped, it was fighting on its own territory, defending its homeland. This matters psychologically. Honduran soldiers knew they were fighting to protect their families and their land. This gave them a morale advantage. The early hours of the war saw Salvadoran advances. Salvadoran troops pushed several kilometers into Honduran territory in some areas. They seized a few small towns. They advanced along roads, moving faster than Honduran defenders could respond. But as day broke on July 15th, the situation began to change. Honduran forces established defensive positions. They blocked roads. They destroyed bridges. They dug in on high ground and waited. When Salvadoran troops advanced into these positions, they ran into serious resistance. Honduran troops, using mortars and machine guns, inflicted casualties on the advancing Salvadorans. The easy victories the Salvadoran commanders had expected did not materialize. The war in the air was equally chaotic. Both countries had tiny air forces equipped with obsolete aircraft. El Salvador had a handful of Mustang fighters and modified transport planes. Honduras had similar equipment, plus a few Corsair fighters left over from World War II. These were piston-engine propeller planes, decades out of date by 1969 standards. Most of the world's air forces were flying jets by this time, but in Central America, these old warplanes were what was available. And in an odd historical footnote, the air war between El Salvador and Honduras would be the last time in history that piston-engine fighters engaged in combat. The last dogfights of the propeller age, pilots on both sides flew dangerous missions. They bombed and strafed ground targets. They fought each other in the skies over Honduras. Several planes were shot down on both sides. Pilots were killed or captured. Both air forces suffered losses that they could barely afford. And critically, neither side could achieve air superiority. Neither could dominate the skies. This meant the ground war would be decided by ground forces, slogging through difficult terrain, fighting small unit actions, taking casualties. By July 16th, the war had settled into a grinding stalemate in some areas and continued Salvadoran advances in others. Salvadoran troops had penetrated up to 15 kilometers into Honduras in the northern sector. They had seized several towns, but they were overstretched. Their supply lines were lengthening. They were taking casualties, and they were running into increasingly organized Honduran resistance. Honduran forces, having recovered from the initial surprise, were counterattacking in some areas. Honduran artillery was shelling Salvadoran positions. The easy victory that El Salvador's leaders had imagined was not happening. And then the civilian suffering began in earnest. War always hits civilians hardest. In the areas occupied by Salvadoran forces, Honduran civilians fled or hid in terror. Some were killed in crossfire. Others were killed deliberately in reprisal attacks. There were reports, difficult to verify but consistent across multiple sources, of Salvadoran soldiers killing Honduran civilians, burning villages, looting, committing atrocities. This is not unique to this war. This is what happens in war. When young men with guns are frightened and angry, when they see their friends killed, when they are told the enemy is subhuman, they commit atrocities. War crimes are not aberrations. They are normal features of armed conflict. Honduran forces and civilians also committed atrocities. Salvadoran civilians and Salvadoran immigrants in Honduras were targeted. Mobs attacked Salvadoran neighborhoods in Honduran cities far from the fighting. Homes were burned. People were beaten. There are documented cases of Salvadoran immigrants being killed by Honduran mobs. The distinction between combatants and civilians collapsed. If you were Salvadoran in Honduras, you were the enemy. If you were Honduran in occupied territory, you were the enemy. Nationality became a death sentence. The refugee crisis exploded. Honduran civilians fled from advancing Salvadoran troops. They packed whatever they could carry and ran. Thousands of people streaming away from the combat zones, clogging roads, overwhelming the capacity of Honduran authorities to help them. At the same time, Salvadoran civilians and immigrants in Honduras were fleeing in the opposite direction, trying to escape persecution and reach the safety of El Salvador. The border region became a nightmare of displaced people moving in both directions, traumatized families, children separated from parents, elderly people unable to keep up, the sick and wounded with nowhere to go. International organizations tried to help but were overwhelmed. The Red Cross attempted to provide medical care and humanitarian assistance, but had insufficient resources and personnel. The Catholic Church, which had significant presence in both countries, tried to shelter refugees and provide food. But the scale of the crisis was beyond what these organizations could handle. Thousands of people were sleeping in fields, in abandoned buildings, under trees. Disease spread rapidly in the overcrowded refugee camps. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid. Children were dying of preventable illnesses because there was no clean water, no sanitation, no medical care. This is the reality of war that doesn't make it into the glory stories. The invisible suffering of people who had no role in causing the conflict but bore its consequences. By July 17th, international pressure was building. The Organization of American States called an emergency meeting. Representatives from countries across the hemisphere gathered to discuss the crisis. The United States, which had significant economic and political interests in Central America, began pushing both sides toward a ceasefire. American diplomats contacted both López Arellano and Sánchez Hernández, urging them to stop the fighting. The message was clear. If the war continued, there would be consequences. Economic aid might be cut. Trade relationships might be affected. The United States was willing to use its considerable leverage to force peace. But the fighting continued. Both sides had committed too much to back down easily. Both governments had whipped their populations into nationalist fervor. Both militaries believed they could still win. Salvadoran forces were still advancing in some sectors, still seizing territory, still hoping for a decisive breakthrough. Honduran forces were fighting desperately to hold their positions, to stop the invasion, to protect their country. Neither side wanted to be the first to blink. Neither wanted to appear weak. On July 18th, the Organization of American States passed a resolution demanding an immediate ceasefire. The resolution called on both countries to stop fighting, to withdraw forces, to negotiate. It threatened sanctions against any country that refused to comply. This was significant. The OAS rarely took such strong action. The fact that they passed this resolution showed how seriously the international community viewed the conflict. There was real fear that this war could spread, that other Central American countries might be drawn in. that regional stability was at risk. El Salvador initially refused to comply. Sanchez Hernandez argued that El Salvador was the victim, that Honduras had started the conflict by expelling Salvadoran immigrants, that El Salvador had the right to defend its citizens. He claimed that Salvadoran forces would not withdraw until Honduras agreed to compensate the expelled immigrants and guarantee their safety. This was a negotiating position, a way to extract concessions. But it also reflected genuine anger. Many Salvadorans believed their country was fighting a just war. They believed Honduras had committed the first acts of aggression. They wanted victory, not negotiation. But the pressure was too great. The United States made it clear that if El Salvador did not agree to a ceasefire, there would be serious economic consequences. American economic aid, which El Salvador desperately needed, would be suspended. Trade preferences might be revoked. The Salvadoran economy, already strained by the war effort, could not afford to lose American support. Sanchez Hernandez had no choice. On July 18th, he agreed to a ceasefire. The guns would fall silent, except they didn't. Not immediately. Ceasefires on paper don't always translate to peace on the ground. Soldiers who have been fighting for days, who have seen their friends killed, who are exhausted and traumatized and full of adrenaline, don't just stop because politicians sign a document. There were continued clashes after the ceasefire was announced. Small unit engagements, artillery exchanges, patrols running into each other and opening fire. It took days for the ceasefire to truly take hold. And during those days, more people died. Finally, by July 20th, the fighting had mostly stopped. Both sides were exhausted. Both had taken significant casualties. Both had achieved less than they hoped. The war had lasted approximately 100 hours of active combat, though the exact duration depends on how you count. From the first airstrikes on the evening of July 14th until the ceasefire took effect around July 18th or 19th, roughly 4.5 days, 100 hours. A short war by historical standards. But measured in human suffering, it was an eternity. The human cost was staggering. The exact death toll has never been determined with certainty. Different sources give different numbers. The Salvadoran government claimed relatively low casualties on their side, fewer than 1,000 dead. The Honduran government gave higher numbers, claiming several thousand dead, most of them civilians. International observers and historians who have studied the war generally estimate that between 3,000 and 6,000 people died. The majority were Honduran civilians, some killed in the fighting, many killed in reprisal attacks, massacres, mob violence. Salvadoran military casualties were probably between 1,000 and 2,000. Honduran military casualties were similar. But the civilian death toll, particularly among Hondurans, was horrific. Beyond deaths, there were thousands wounded, soldiers with bullet wounds, shrapnel injuries, burns, civilians caught in explosions or beaten by mobs. The medical infrastructure in both countries was primitive. Many wounded people died because there was no adequate medical care. Others survived but were permanently disabled, lost limbs, lost eyes, psychological trauma that would never heal. And then there were the refugees. Over 100,000 people, perhaps as many as 300,000, were displaced by the war. Most were Salvadorans expelled from Honduras or fleeing violence. But there were also Hondurans fleeing occupied territory or fleeing persecution in El Salvador. These people had lost everything: their homes, their land, their possessions, their livelihoods. They became a permanent refugee population, living in camps, dependent on international aid, with no clear path back to normal life. The economic damage was immense. Infrastructure in the combat zones was destroyed. Roads, bridges, power lines, water systems, crops were burned, livestock killed or scattered, businesses destroyed. Both countries spent money they didn't have on the war effort. Money that should have gone to education, healthcare, development was spent on bullets and bombs. The economic cost of the war would echo for decades. Both El Salvador and Honduras were poor before the war. The war made them poorer, and the war solved nothing. None of the underlying problems were addressed. El Salvador still had too many people and not enough land. Honduras still had an economy dominated by foreign corporations and corrupt elites. The expelled Salvadoran immigrants did not get their land back. There was no compensation. There was no justice. The ceasefire simply froze the situation. Both sides claimed victory. Both sides claimed the other had started it. And both sides remained bitter enemies. But we're not done yet. Because the ceasefire in July 1969 was not the end of this story. What happened after the guns stopped firing is in many ways just as important as the war itself. The aftermath, the consequences, the long-term effects of this brief but brutal conflict would shape Central America for decades to come. Part 6. The Aftermath and Failed Peace. When the shooting stopped in late July 1969, both countries faced immediate crises. The most urgent was the refugee situation. Tens of thousands of displaced people were living in makeshift camps along the border. They had minimal food, no clean water, inadequate shelter. Disease was spreading rapidly. Children were dying. International aid organizations were trying to help but were overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. Both governments needed to figure out what to do with these people, but neither government had resources or plans. El Salvador faced the problem of absorbing over 100,000 refugees, possibly many more. These were Salvadorans who had been living in Honduras, farming land they had cleared and worked for years or even decades. Now they were back in El Salvador with nothing. No land, no money, no tools, no homes. The Salvadoran government had no land to give them. Remember, El Salvador's fundamental problem was land scarcity. That's why these people had migrated to Honduras in the first place. Now they were back, and the problem was worse than ever. The government established refugee camps, but these were meant to be temporary. Nobody knew what the long-term solution would be. Honduras had its own refugee crisis, though smaller. Hondurans who had fled occupied territory or fled persecution in El Salvador needed help. But Honduras also faced enormous infrastructure damage. The fighting had destroyed roads, bridges, and buildings in the combat zones. Agricultural land had been mined or contaminated. Entire villages had been burned. The economic cost was crushing for a country that was already one of the poorest in the hemisphere. Both governments also faced political problems. In El Salvador, Sanchez Hernandez had to explain why the war had not delivered the victory he had promised. Salvadoran forces had advanced into Honduras but had been forced to withdraw. Territory had been seized and then given back. Salvadoran soldiers had died for nothing. The expelled immigrants had not been returned to their land. What exactly had been achieved? The government claimed moral victory, claimed they had defended Salvadoran honor, but this rang hollow to many people who saw the war as a costly failure. In Honduras, López Arellano was in a stronger political position. He could claim that Honduras had successfully defended itself against aggression. Honduran forces had held their ground. The invasion had been stopped. Honduras had not been conquered. This narrative played well domestically. López Arellano emerged from the war with his political position strengthened, but he still faced economic crisis and the challenge of rebuilding. The diplomatic aftermath was complex and bitter. The ceasefire had stopped the fighting, but it had not resolved any of the underlying disputes. There were still questions about borders, about the status of Salvadoran immigrants, about compensation, about blame. The Organization of American States attempted to mediate. They established a commission to investigate the causes of the war and propose solutions. But both countries were uncooperative. Each side insisted the other was entirely to blame. Each side demanded concessions the other would not give. The border remained closed. Trade between the two countries stopped. This was economically damaging to both. El Salvador and Honduras had significant trade relationships before the war. They exchanged goods, had cross-border business relationships, participated in a Central American common market. All of this ended. The border closure hurt both economies, but neither government was willing to back down. Opening the border would have been seen as weakness. There were ongoing military tensions. Both sides maintained large troop concentrations along the border. There were frequent incidents, shots fired across the border, patrols encountering each other, accusations of violations. The fear was that fighting could break out again at any moment. Both militaries remained on high alert. This was expensive. Keeping troops mobilized, maintaining defensive positions, staying in a state of readiness drained resources from both countries. International mediation efforts dragged on for months. The OAS tried to broker a comprehensive peace agreement. They proposed various solutions: demilitarized zones, international observers, compensation funds, treaties guaranteeing the rights of immigrants. But every proposal ran into obstacles. El Salvador demanded that Salvadoran immigrants be allowed to return to their land in Honduras. Honduras refused. Honduras demanded that El Salvador pay reparations for the damage caused by the invasion. El Salvador refused. Each side had maximalist demands and was unwilling to compromise. The situation festered. Months passed, then years. The immediate crisis of the war faded from international attention. The world moved on to other conflicts, other crises. But in Central America, the wounds remained open. The two countries remained enemies. The border remained closed. The refugees remained in camps, their situation shifting from temporary to semi-permanent to permanent. A generation of children grew up in refugee camps, knowing no other life. The Salvadoran refugees in El Salvador became a permanent underclass. They had no land, no resources, no opportunities. Some found work as laborers, accepting the lowest wages, living in slums. Others remained dependent on government aid that grew scarcer over time. Many became radicalized. They had been promised that the war would solve their problems. It hadn't. They had been told their government would protect them. It hadn't. They had lost everything, and they were angry. This anger would have consequences. Because here's the thing about war and displacement and broken promises: they create the conditions for future violence. When you have large populations of desperate, angry, landless people with no hope and no future, they become recruitable. Recruitable by revolutionaries, recruitable by guerrillas, recruitable by anyone who promises change, even violent change. The refugees from the football war would form a significant base of support for the revolutionary movements that would soon emerge in El Salvador. The 1970s in El Salvador saw increasing political violence. Leftist guerrilla groups formed, demanding land reform, social justice, an end to oligarchic rule. These groups found ready recruits among the landless refugees, people who had nothing to lose, people who had been betrayed by their government, people who saw violence as the only path to change. The Salvadoran government responded with repression, death squads, disappearances, massacres. The violence escalated throughout the decade. By 1980, El Salvador descended into full-scale civil war. Guerrillas controlled large parts of the countryside. The government, backed by the United States, fought to maintain control. The civil war would last 12 years. From 1980 to 1992, over 75,000 people would die. Hundreds of thousands would be displaced. The violence was horrific. Massacres of civilians, death squad killings, torture, entire villages destroyed. And while the Civil War had many causes, while it was rooted in decades of inequality and oppression, the football war contributed. The refugees from 1969, the failed promises, the bitter resentment, all of this fed into the revolutionary movements of the 70s and 80s. Honduras also faced instability, though it avoided full-scale civil war. The refugee situation created tensions. The economic damage from the war hindered development. Military governments continued to dominate, responding to dissent with repression. Honduras became increasingly dependent on the United States, which used Honduras as a base for supporting anti-communist forces in Nicaragua and El Salvador during the Cold War conflicts of the 1980s. Honduras's sovereignty was compromised. Its territory was used for proxy wars. Its people paid the price. The border between El Salvador and Honduras remained a source of tension for decades. It wasn't until 1992, 23 years after the war, that a final peace treaty was signed. The International Court of Justice at The Hague finally settled the border disputes in 1992. The border was demarcated. Territory was allocated. Formal peace was declared. But the human damage could never be undone. Families had been separated for decades. People who had fled in 1969 grew old and died without ever returning to their homes. Children grew up as refugees. The economic opportunities lost, the lives destroyed, the trauma inflicted. All of this was permanent. You can sign peace treaties. You can draw borders on maps. But you can't give people back their lost years. You can't resurrect the dead. You can't heal the deepest wounds. And tragically, almost nobody learned the lessons. The football war should have been a warning about the dangers of nationalism, about the ease with which populations can be manipulated into violence, about how sports rivalries can be weaponized, about how refugee crises create humanitarian catastrophes, about how wars never solve the underlying problems. But these lessons were ignored. Central America continued to suffer through decades of violence. Civil wars in El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, military coups, death squads, foreign interventions. The cycle of violence continued. Part 7. Why we forgot and why it matters. So why don't we know this story? Why is the football war, despite its drama and its tragedy and its thousands of dead, largely forgotten? Why do most people, even educated people interested in history, have no idea this war happened? There are several reasons. First, timing. The football war happened in July 1969. This was the same month that Apollo 11 landed on the moon. The entire world was watching Neil Armstrong take his first steps on the lunar surface. That was the story that dominated headlines globally. A brief war between two small Central American countries couldn't compete with humanity's greatest achievement. The moon landing overshadowed everything else that month. News editors had to make choices about what to cover. They chose the moon. Second, location. El Salvador and Honduras are small countries. They're not major powers. They don't have significant influence in global affairs. Wars between small countries in peripheral regions don't get the same attention as wars involving major powers or wars in strategically important regions. This is a harsh reality of international news coverage. Some places matter more to global audiences than others. Fair or not, a war in Central America gets less attention than a war in Europe or the Middle East. Third, the Cold War context. In 1969, the world was divided by the Cold War. The great conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union dominated international relations. Wars tended to get attention based on their Cold War significance. Was this a communist insurgency? Was this a proxy war between superpowers? The football war was neither. It was a local conflict driven by local issues. There was no communist angle, no superpower involvement. So from a Cold War perspective, it didn't matter much. American policymakers and journalists saw it as a minor border dispute, not a significant geopolitical event. Fourth, the brevity. The active fighting lasted only about 4 days. By the time international journalists could deploy to the region, the ceasefire had been declared. There were no dramatic battles to film, no prolonged siege to cover. The war was over before the media apparatus could fully engage. This made it a less compelling story for sustained coverage. Wars that last months or years generate continuous news. Wars that last days get a mention and then fade. Fifth, language and access. El Salvador and Honduras are Spanish-speaking countries. Most international journalists covering the region were based in Mexico City or elsewhere, not in the countries themselves. Getting access to the conflict zones was difficult. Understanding the local context required language skills and local knowledge that many foreign correspondents didn't have. So the coverage was often superficial. A few paragraphs in major newspapers, brief mentions on television news, nothing that would create lasting memory in the global consciousness. And finally, there's the simple fact that history is selective. We can't remember everything. The 20th century was filled with conflicts. Major wars like World War II and Vietnam dominate historical memory because of their scale and their impact on major powers. Smaller conflicts, even those with thousands of casualties, tend to be forgotten unless they have some unique characteristic that captures imagination. The football war's nickname, the suggestion that soccer caused it, might have made it memorable. But because the full story is more complex and less catchy than the nickname suggests, even that didn't save it from obscurity. But the football war should be remembered, not just as historical curiosity, not just as a tragic footnote, but because it teaches us crucial lessons that remain relevant today. Let me explain why this war matters to us now, in the 21st century, decades after the guns fell silent. First, it shows us how easily sports can be weaponized. Soccer didn't cause this war, but soccer provided the emotional intensity, the tribal identity, the us versus them mentality that made war possible. The matches gave people a framework for expressing nationalist aggression. They provided moments of collective humiliation and collective triumph that politicians exploited. We like to think of sports as harmless, as a healthy outlet for competitive instincts, as something that brings people together. And often it does. But the football war reminds us that sports can also divide, that sporting rivalries can turn toxic, that the passion we feel for our teams can be redirected toward hatred of others. This is still relevant. We see it in modern soccer hooliganism, in violent clashes between rival fans, in racism and nationalism expressed through sports. The same mechanisms that turned soccer matches into war propaganda in 1969 still exist. We need to be aware of them. We need to recognize when sports are being used to manipulate us emotionally, when our love of our team is being transformed into hatred of others. Second, the football war shows us the refugee crisis dynamics that continue to plague our world. 300,000 Salvadoran immigrants in Honduras were vulnerable because of their ambiguous legal status. When political conditions changed, when they became convenient scapegoats, they were expelled with violence. This pattern repeats throughout history and around the world. Immigrant populations, especially those without secure legal status, are always vulnerable. They can be blamed for economic problems. They can be portrayed as threats to national identity. They can be targeted by governments looking for easy political wins. We see this today in migration crises around the world, in the treatment of refugees from Syria, from Myanmar, from Central America itself. The same dynamics that led to the expulsion of Salvadorans from Honduras in 1969 are visible in contemporary anti-immigrant politics. The scapegoating, the dehumanization, the willingness to destroy lives for political gain. Understanding the football war helps us recognize these patterns when we see them today. Third, the war demonstrates how media manipulation and propaganda can create the conditions for violence. Both the Salvadoran and Honduran media outlets published exaggerated and false atrocity stories. They amplified every grievance. They portrayed the other side as monsters. They created an environment where violence seemed justified, even necessary. The populations of both countries were systematically prepared for war through media messaging that dehumanized the enemy and inflamed nationalist passion. This should sound familiar. We live in an era of sophisticated media manipulation, of social media echo chambers, of algorithm-driven content that shows us material designed to provoke emotional responses, of foreign actors using information warfare to destabilize democracies. The techniques are more advanced now, but the fundamental dynamic is the same. Use media to make people angry, make them afraid, make them hate, then mobilize that hate for political purposes. The football war is a case study in how this works and where it leads. Fourth, the war shows how easily violence can escalate once it starts. The soccer matches created tension. The tension led to riots. The riots led to the refugee crisis. The refugee crisis led to nationalist mobilization. And suddenly, countries were at war. At each stage, there were opportunities to de-escalate, opportunities for leaders to choose peace. But at each stage, the political incentives favored escalation. Leaders who called for calm would have been seen as weak. Leaders who demanded action gained support. So the cycle continued until people were dying. This escalation dynamic is visible in many conflicts, in ethnic tensions that explode into genocide, in territorial disputes that become wars, in political disagreements that become violent polarization. Once you start down the path of dehumanization and violence, it becomes very difficult to turn back. Understanding this helps us recognize when we're on that path, when our rhetoric is becoming too heated, when our political disagreements are transforming into something dangerous. The football war is a warning about how quickly things can spiral out of control. Fifth, the war illustrates the failure of international institutions to prevent conflict. The Organization of American States existed. Diplomatic channels existed. Mechanisms for peaceful resolution existed. But they were too slow, too weak, too reluctant to act decisively. By the time the OAS mobilized to stop the war, thousands were already dead. The international community was more focused on larger Cold War issues than on what seemed like a minor border dispute. This remains a problem. International institutions like the United Nations have limited power. They can mediate and peacekeep, but they struggle to prevent wars. Powerful countries ignore them when convenient. The international system is better at responding to crises than preventing them. The football war is an example of how the failure of prevention leads to catastrophe. Sixth, and perhaps most important, the football war shows us that war never solves the underlying problems. El Salvador went to war partly because of land scarcity and overpopulation. After the war, El Salvador still had land scarcity and overpopulation. In fact, the problem was worse because now they had to absorb over 100,000 refugees. Honduras went to war partly because of economic stagnation and inequality. After the war, Honduras still had economic stagnation and inequality. In fact, the situation was worse because infrastructure was destroyed and resources had been wasted on fighting. Neither country achieved its objectives. Both countries were worse off. The human cost was staggering, and absolutely nothing was solved. This is true of almost all wars. The problems that cause wars don't get resolved by fighting. They get worse. War destroys resources, kills productive people, creates new grievances, and perpetuates cycles of violence. The only real solutions come from addressing root causes: land reform, economic development, reducing inequality, creating opportunity, building institutions that allow peaceful resolution of disputes. These are hard. They require long-term commitment. They don't offer quick victories or glorious military parades, but they actually work. War doesn't. Part 8. The human stories. Behind the statistics and the political analysis and the military history, there are human stories, individual lives affected by this war. Let me share some of them, reconstructed from historical accounts and testimonies, to help us remember that these were real people, not just numbers. There was a Salvadoran farmer named Carlos. He had lived in Honduras for 20 years. He had migrated in the 1950s, a young man looking for opportunity. He cleared land in an unpopulated region. He built a small house with his own hands. He married a Honduran woman. They had 4 children. He grew corn and beans. He raised chickens. It wasn't much, but it was his. He was proud of what he had built. He got along well with his Honduran neighbors. He considered himself Honduran, even though he had been born in El Salvador. Then came June 1969. After the soccer match in San Salvador, after the riots, the mood changed. His Honduran neighbors, people he had known for years, suddenly looked at him with suspicion, called him a Salvadoran invader, told him to go back where he came from. He tried to explain that this was where he came from. This was his home. His children were Honduran, but it didn't matter. A week later, police came to his farm. They told him he had 2 hours to leave. When he protested, they beat him. His wife pleaded. His children cried. The police burned his house. They confiscated his animals. They told him if he didn't leave immediately, they would kill him. Carlos and his family walked to the border. They carried what they could. His youngest child, a 3-year-old girl, he carried on his shoulders. His wife carried their infant son. The older children carried bundles of clothes and a few precious possessions. They walked for 2 days. They had no food. They drank from streams. They slept in fields. When they reached El Salvador, they had nothing. They went to a refugee camp. They lived in a tent. Carlos tried to find work, but there were thousands of other refugees competing for the same jobs. His wife got sick, dysentery from contaminated water in the camp. She nearly died. Their infant son did die. Malnutrition and disease. He was 6 months old. Carlos never recovered from this. He had worked his entire adult life to build something, to create a better life for his family, and it had been stolen in an instant. Not because he had done anything wrong, simply because of where he was born. He became bitter, angry at Honduras for expelling him, angry at El Salvador for not protecting him, angry at the world. When revolutionary groups began recruiting in the refugee camps in the 1970s, Carlos joined. He didn't really believe in their ideology. He just wanted to fight. He wanted someone to pay for what had been done to him. He was killed in 1981 in the Salvadoran Civil War, fighting for a cause he barely understood, leaving behind a wife and 3 surviving children in poverty. Or consider Maria, a Honduran woman who lived in a small town near the border. She was a school teacher. She taught elementary school, 1st and 2nd grade. She loved her students. She had students from both Honduran and Salvadoran families. In her classroom, nationality didn't matter. She taught them to read and write. She taught them songs. She gave them encouragement and hope. She believed education could lift people out of poverty. When the war came in July 1969, her town was in the combat zone. Salvadoran troops advanced through the area. There was fighting in the streets. Maria hid with her students in the schoolhouse. She tried to keep them calm, tried to protect them, but a shell hit the building. Part of the roof collapsed. 3 children were killed instantly. Maria was wounded by shrapnel. A piece of metal lodged in her spine. She survived, but was paralyzed from the waist down. 32 years old, and she would never walk again. After the war, Maria couldn't teach anymore. The school was destroyed. Her injury left her unable to stand. unable to write on the blackboard, unable to move around the classroom. She lived with her parents, dependent on them for care. She fell into deep depression. She had nightmares about the explosion, about the children screaming, about the blood. She outlived her parents and spent her final years in a care facility, forgotten by everyone except a few former students who visited occasionally. She died in 1997, 28 years after the war, but in a real sense the war had killed her that day in July 1969. Or think about Lieutenant Roberto, a young Salvadoran military officer, 24 years old, from a middle-class family in San Salvador. He had joined the military because it offered stable employment and a chance to serve his country. He wasn't particularly political. He wasn't driven by ideology. He just wanted to do his duty. When the war started, he was ordered to lead his platoon into Honduras. He obeyed orders. He witnessed and participated in terrible things. His unit burned villages. They were told these villages were harboring Honduran soldiers. Maybe they were. Maybe they weren't. Roberto didn't know. He just followed orders. They killed people. Combatants, certainly, but also people who might have been civilians. In the confusion of combat, it was hard to tell. Roberto shot a man who was running away. He was ordered to fire. So he did. He didn't know if the man was a soldier or a farmer. He didn't know if the man was armed. He just knew he followed orders, and the man fell dead. When Roberto returned from the war, he couldn't forget what he had seen and done. He started drinking heavily. He had nightmares. We would call it PTSD today, but in 1969 in El Salvador, there was no diagnosis, no treatment, no understanding. He was just seen as weak, unable to handle combat. He left the military. He drifted between jobs. His drinking got worse. His marriage fell apart. He ended up homeless. He died in the early 1990s, liver destroyed by alcohol, alone in a San Salvador slum, another casualty of the war, though his name appears on no memorial. These stories, and thousands like them, are the real cost of the football war. Not just the statistics, not just the political analysis, but individual lives destroyed, children killed, families torn apart, dreams shattered, trauma that echoed through decades. Every single person who died had a name, had a family, had hopes and fears, had a life that mattered. And they died because political leaders made decisions that served their own interests, because media whipped up nationalist fervor, because international institutions failed to act, because humans have a terrible capacity to hate and kill when given permission and justification. Part 9. Comparative Analysis. How the Football War Fits into History. To truly understand the football war, it helps to compare it to other conflicts, to see how it fits into broader patterns of human violence and folly. Let me walk you through several comparisons that illuminate different aspects of this war. First, let's compare the football war to other wars that seemingly started over trivial causes. The most famous is probably the War of Jenkins' Ear, a conflict between Britain and Spain in the 1830s that allegedly started when Spanish Coast Guards cut off the ear of British captain Robert Jenkins. Or the War of the Bucket in medieval Italy, where Bologna and Modena went to war supposedly because Modenese soldiers stole a wooden bucket from Bologna. These wars are often presented as absurd, as evidence of historical irrationality. But in every case, including the football war, the seemingly trivial trigger was just the excuse. Jenkins' Ear was a pretext for British commercial and imperial ambitions in the Caribbean. The bucket was a symbol in long-standing conflicts between Italian city-states. The soccer matches between El Salvador and Honduras were a spark that ignited tensions built over decades. The pattern is clear. Wars don't actually happen because of insults or stolen buckets or soccer games. They happen because of deeper, structural factors. economic competition, resource scarcity, political instability. The trivial triggers just provide the immediate justification. Understanding this helps us see through propaganda. When leaders say, "We must fight because of some specific incident," we should ask what the real causes are. What interests are being served? What problems are being deflected from? Second, let's compare the football war to ethnic conflicts. Wars like the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, where ethnic groups that had lived together for decades suddenly turned on each other in horrific violence. Or the Rwandan genocide, where Hutus massacred Tutsis despite years of intermarriage and shared communities. The football war wasn't primarily ethnic. Both Salvadorans and Hondurans were mestizo populations, sharing similar culture and language, but it had similar dynamics. In all these cases, politicians and media deliberately cultivated hatred between groups that had previously coexisted. They emphasized differences. They spread fear. They portrayed the other group as a threat. They created a permission structure for violence. In Yugoslavia, nationalist politicians told Serbs that Croats and Muslims were planning to destroy them. In Rwanda, Hutu extremists spread propaganda claiming Tutsis were planning genocide against Hutus, justifying preemptive violence. In El Salvador and Honduras, media and political leaders portrayed each other's populations as enemies, as threats to national survival. The lesson is chilling. Ordinary people, peaceful neighbors, can be turned into killers with remarkable speed if the propaganda is effective. Humans have deep psychological mechanisms for tribal identity and fear of outsiders. These mechanisms evolved over millions of years when humans lived in small bands competing for resources. They made sense in that environment, but in modern complex societies, these same mechanisms can be weaponized. Politicians who understand this can manipulate populations into supporting or committing atrocities. The football war is a case study in how this manipulation works. Third, let's compare the football war to refugee crises throughout history. The expulsion of 300,000 Salvadorans from Honduras in 1969 parallels many other forced population movements. The expulsion of Germans from Eastern Europe after World War II. The partition of India and Pakistan in 1947, with massive population exchanges and horrific violence. The Syrian refugee crisis of the 2010s. The Rohingya driven from Myanmar. In every case, we see similar patterns. A population that has lived in a place for years or generations suddenly becomes categorized as other, as foreign, as unwanted. Legal mechanisms or violence or both are used to force them out. The expelled population suffers enormously. They lose property, livelihoods, often lives. They become refugees, dependent on aid, often stuck in camps for years or decades. The receiving areas struggle to absorb them. Humanitarian crises develop, and the underlying problems that caused the migration in the first place remain unresolved. The football war refugee crisis was relatively small by historical standards. 300,000 displaced is tragic, but it's dwarfed by the 15 million displaced during India-Pakistan partition, or the millions fleeing Syria. But the mechanisms are the same, and the lesson is the same. Forced population movements never solve problems. They create humanitarian catastrophes. They generate long-term instability. They sow seeds for future conflicts. The only real solutions involve addressing root causes, creating legal frameworks that protect migrants, building institutions that can manage population movements humanely. This is difficult work. It requires international cooperation. It requires challenging nationalist politicians who find scapegoating immigrants politically useful. But it's the only path that actually works. Fourth, let's compare the football war to other Cold War-era conflicts in Latin America. The 1960s 70s, and 80s saw numerous wars, coups, insurgencies, and interventions in Central and South America. Guatemala's Civil War, Nicaragua's Revolution and Contra War, El Salvador's Civil War, Argentina's Dirty War, Chile's coup, and Pinochet dictatorship. These conflicts were shaped by Cold War dynamics, by American and Soviet involvement, by ideological struggles between capitalism and communism, by issues of land reform and social justice. The football war is unusual because it wasn't primarily about Cold War ideology. It wasn't a communist insurgency. It wasn't an American-backed coup. It was a more traditional interstate war over borders, resources, and population pressure. But it's connected to the broader pattern. The same conditions that caused the football war, land inequality, poverty, weak institutions, authoritarian governments, also contributed to the civil wars that followed. The refugees from the football war became recruits for revolutionary movements. The militarization and nationalist mobilization of the football war made violence seem normal, acceptable, even glorious. The failure to address underlying problems meant that Central America remained unstable, remained violent, remained a region where conflict was always simmering beneath the surface. And American policy toward Central America, which focused on preventing communism rather than addressing root causes of instability, failed to prevent or resolve these conflicts. The United States sent military aid, trained soldiers, backed authoritarian governments, all in the name of fighting communism. But this approach didn't create stability. It didn't create prosperity. It didn't create democracy. It just prolonged violence and suffering. The football war is a reminder that conflicts have local causes that can't be understood purely through Cold War lenses. Real solutions require understanding local dynamics, addressing local problems, not just projecting great power rivalries onto every situation. Fifth, let's compare the football war to modern conflicts driven by resource scarcity and climate change. This is perhaps the most important comparison for our current era. The football war was fundamentally about land. El Salvador didn't have enough arable land for its population. This drove migration to Honduras. When that migration was reversed, it created an impossible situation. Too many people, not enough resources, leading to instability and violence. This dynamic is becoming increasingly common. Climate change is making some regions uninhabitable or unproductive. Desertification, rising sea levels, changing rainfall patterns, extreme weather events. These environmental changes drive migration. People move from areas that can no longer support them to areas with more resources. This creates tensions in the receiving areas. Local populations resent the newcomers. Politicians exploit these tensions. Violence can result. We're seeing this in parts of Africa, where climate-driven migration is contributing to conflict. We're seeing it in the Middle East, where water scarcity exacerbates political tensions. We're seeing it in Central America right now, where drought and crop failures are driving migration northward toward the United States. The football war is a preview of climate-driven conflicts. It shows what happens when resource scarcity combines with weak institutions, authoritarian politics, and nationalist mobilization. And it should terrify us, because climate change is going to create resource scarcity on a scale far larger than 1960s. Central America, hundreds of millions of people may be displaced by climate change over the coming decades. If we handle these migrations the way El Salvador and Honduras handled their crisis in 1969, we're facing catastrophic violence. The only way to prevent this is to prepare now. Build institutions that can manage migration humanely, create legal frameworks for climate refugees, address climate change itself to reduce displacement, strengthen international cooperation. These are enormous challenges. But the football war shows us what happens when we fail. Part 10. What could have been done differently? One of the most painful aspects of studying the football war is recognizing how preventable it was. At multiple points, different choices could have averted the catastrophe. Let's walk through the key decision points and explore what could have been done differently. First, the immediate aftermath of the soccer matches. When violence erupted after the June 15th game in San Salvador, when Honduran fans and immigrants were attacked, this should have been a clear warning sign. Both governments should have acted immediately to de-escalate. The Salvadoran government should have condemned the violence, protected Hondurans in El Salvador, and worked to calm nationalist fervor. The Honduran government should have resisted the temptation to retaliate. Both governments should have reached out to each other, perhaps through OAS mediation, to address tensions before they escalated further. Instead, both governments encouraged, or at minimum tolerated, the nationalist mobilization. Salvadoran officials celebrated the attacks as expressions of patriotic fervor. Honduran officials used the attacks as justification for their own anti-Salvadoran actions. This was a catastrophic failure of leadership. Leaders are supposed to unite populations, to calm tensions, to prevent violence. Instead, these leaders inflamed tensions for political gain. Imagine if Sanchez Hernandez had gone on television after the San Salvador riots and said something like this: "Fellow Salvadorans, I understand your passion for our national team, but the violence we saw today is unacceptable. Hondurans in our country are our neighbors, our friends, sometimes our family. We cannot let a soccer game destroy our relationships. I am ordering police to protect all Hondurans in El Salvador and to arrest anyone who commits violence. And I am reaching out to President López Arellano to ensure that Salvadorans in Honduras are also protected. We are better than this violence." That speech would have been politically risky. Nationalists would have called him weak, but it might have broken the cycle of escalation. It would have denied permission for violence. It would have reframed the situation from us versus them to "we are all Central Americans who need to live together." Leadership is making hard choices that serve long-term interests over short-term political gain. Both leaders failed this test completely. Second, the expulsion of Salvadoran immigrants from Honduras. This was a deliberate policy choice by the Honduran government. It didn't have to happen. There were alternatives. Honduras could have implemented actual land reform, taking land from wealthy Hondurans and foreign corporations rather than from poor Salvadoran immigrants. This would have been politically difficult because it would have threatened powerful interests. But it was the right policy. It would have addressed the real problem of landlessness among Hondurans without creating a humanitarian crisis. Or Honduras could have created a path to legal status for long-term Salvadoran residents. Many of these immigrants had been in Honduras for decades. Their children were born there. They were integrated into communities. Honduras could have offered them citizenship or permanent residency. This would have diffused the resentment against them as foreign squatters. It would have recognized reality rather than pretending that 300,000 people could just disappear. Again, this would have been politically controversial, but it was achievable. Many countries have successfully integrated immigrant populations. It requires political will and leadership. Instead, López Arellano chose the politically easy and morally bankrupt option: scapegoat the vulnerable, expel people who couldn't defend themselves. This solved nothing and created a massive humanitarian crisis that made war almost inevitable. Third, the international response. The Organization of American States and the United States should have intervened much earlier and much more forcefully. When the expulsions began in late June, when thousands of refugees started streaming across the border with stories of violence, this should have triggered immediate international action. The OAS should have sent observers, They should have offered mediation. They should have threatened sanctions against Honduras if the expulsions continued. The United States, which had enormous economic leverage over both countries, should have made clear that violence would have consequences. Instead, the international community was slow to act, distracted by other issues, uninterested in what seemed like a minor regional dispute. By the time the OAS mobilized, war had already started. This is a pattern we see repeatedly. International institutions are reactive rather than proactive. They respond to crises but don't prevent them. This needs to change. We need international mechanisms that can identify escalating tensions early and intervene before violence starts. We need to empower international observers, mediators, and peacekeepers to act quickly. We need major powers to use their leverage for prevention rather than waiting until it's too late. Fourth, addressing root causes. Even before the soccer matches, even before the refugee crisis, both countries faced structural problems that needed to be addressed. El Salvador needed land reform desperately. The concentration of land ownership in a few elite families was unsustainable in a country with a rapidly growing population. Real land reform, redistributing land to peasants, would have reduced pressure from migration. It would have given people stake in their own country. It would have reduced the desperation that made people willing to risk everything to clear land in Honduras. But land reform threatened the oligarchy. The 14 families and their allies controlled Salvadoran politics. They blocked any serious reform. The military, which could have forced reform, instead allied with the oligarchy. This was short-sighted. By refusing to reform, by refusing to share power and resources, the oligarchy guaranteed eventual revolution. The civil war that devastated El Salvador in the 1980s was the direct result of refusing to address inequality peacefully. The oligarchs thought they could maintain their position forever through repression. They were wrong. They just postponed the reckoning and made it more violent. Honduras needed economic reform. The dominance of foreign corporations, particularly United Fruit Company, was extractive colonialism. Honduras's resources were being exploited for the benefit of American shareholders, while Hondurans remained in poverty. Honduras needed to assert control over its own economy, to demand fair taxation of corporations, to invest in infrastructure, education, healthcare, to build an economy that served Honduran interests rather than foreign interests. But this required standing up to powerful corporations and to the United States, which backed those corporations. Honduran leaders lacked the political will or the power to do this, so Honduras remained poor and unstable, and that instability eventually manifested in violence. Both countries needed institution building, strong democratic institutions, independent judiciaries, professional civil services, free press, civil society organizations. These institutions create channels for addressing grievances peacefully. They constrain authoritarian leaders. They protect vulnerable populations. They make violence less likely because people have other options for seeking change. But institution building is slow and difficult. It requires long-term commitment. It doesn't offer quick political wins. It's much easier to rule through patronage and repression, which is what both governments did. This short-term thinking guaranteed long-term instability. Fifth, both countries needed to invest in education and economic opportunity, creating jobs, building industries, developing human capital. When young people have opportunities, when they have hope for the future, they don't join guerrilla movements or participate in riots. Unemployment and hopelessness are breeding grounds for violence. Both El Salvador and Honduras had large young populations with limited opportunities. This was a powder keg. Investment in education and economic development would have been far cheaper than the cost of war and the subsequent decades of instability. But again, this required vision and commitment that the leadership lacked. It was easier to maintain the status quo, to enrich themselves and their allies, to kick problems down the road, until the problems exploded. The tragedy of the football war is that it was entirely preventable. Every step of the escalation could have been stopped. Different choices at any point could have averted the catastrophe. But those choices weren't made because the leaders lacked wisdom, because they prioritized short-term political gain over long-term stability, because international institutions were weak and slow, because economic elites refused to share power or resources, because nobody wanted to do the hard work of addressing root causes. And so 3,000 people died, and 100,000 became refugees, and 2 countries were devastated, and the cycle of violence continued for decades. All because of choices that didn't have to be made. All because of failures that could have been avoided. Part 11. Modern Parallels and Warning Signs. Now let's bring this into the present. Let's talk about how the dynamics of the football war are visible in our world today. Because the mechanisms that led to that conflict haven't disappeared. If anything, they're more powerful and more dangerous in our interconnected, media-saturated, climate-changing world. First, sports and nationalism. We still see sports being used to inflame nationalist passions. In Europe, soccer matches between certain countries or certain club teams are flashpoints for violence. Fans riot, nationalist chants, racist abuse of players. In some cases, governments deliberately encourage this. They see sports nationalism as a way to build national unity and distract from domestic problems. We saw this in Russia hosting the World Cup while engaged in military aggression in Ukraine. We see it in Qatar hosting the World Cup while exploiting migrant workers. We see it in how authoritarian governments use Olympic Games to project power and legitimacy. The problem is more subtle in democracies but still present. Political leaders wrap themselves in national team colors. They use sports victories to boost their popularity. They frame international sports competitions as battles for national honor. This isn't automatically bad. Sports can create healthy national pride. But we need to be aware of when it crosses the line. When sports rhetoric becomes militaristic, when the other team becomes the enemy rather than worthy opponents, when loss becomes humiliation that demands revenge. These are warning signs. These are the moments when sports stops being harmless competition and becomes a tool for dangerous nationalism. Second, refugee and immigration politics. This is perhaps the most obvious parallel. All around the world, we see politicians scapegoating immigrants, blaming them for economic problems, portraying them as threats to national identity or security, using them as convenient targets to distract from policy failures. This is exactly what happened in Honduras in 1969. And it's happening now in the United States, in Europe, in many other places. We see the same patterns. Immigrants who have been in a country for years, who have built lives and raised families, suddenly facing expulsion, legal status being revoked or never provided in the first place, populations being demonized, children being separated from parents, people being held in camps in inhumane conditions, politicians claiming they're defending the nation, media spreading fear, and the result is always suffering. The immigrants suffer most directly, but the receiving societies also suffer. They lose contributors to their economies. They lose their moral standing. They create resentment and instability, and they don't solve the underlying problems that drove migration in the first place. The Central American migrant caravans of recent years are directly connected to the dynamics we've been discussing. People fleeing El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala because of violence, poverty, and climate change. These are the descendants, literally and figuratively, of the football war. The problems that caused that conflict were never resolved. El Salvador's civil war, Honduras's instability, continued inequality, lack of economic opportunity, and now climate change making things worse. So people migrate, and they face hostility, and politicians exploit that hostility. The cycle continues. Third, media manipulation and echo chambers. In 1969, newspapers and radio were the main media. They were powerful tools for spreading propaganda, but they were limited by technology and reach. Today, social media has made manipulation far easier and more powerful. Algorithms that show people content designed to provoke emotional responses, echo chambers where people only see information that confirms their existing beliefs, foreign actors using bots and fake accounts to spread disinformation, conspiracy theories spreading virally, political movements built on manufactured outrage. We saw this in the 2016 U.S. election, in Brexit, in the rise of far-right movements in Europe, in communal violence in India spread through WhatsApp rumors, in the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar fueled by Facebook hate speech. The mechanisms are the same as in the football war. Spread fear, dehumanize the other, create a sense of threat, generate anger, then channel that anger toward political goals. It's just faster and more efficient now. The danger is that most people don't recognize when they're being manipulated. We like to think we're rational, that we make decisions based on facts. But human psychology is vulnerable to emotional manipulation. When we're scared or angry, we don't think clearly. We accept simple explanations. We look for scapegoats. We trust sources that confirm what we want to believe. Understanding the football war helps us recognize these patterns in ourselves and in our information environment. Fourth, resource scarcity and climate migration. This is the big one, the issue that will define much of 21st century conflict. Climate change is already driving migration. Small island nations being submerged, coastal areas facing repeated flooding, agricultural regions experiencing drought. People are moving, and this is just the beginning. As climate change accelerates, as more regions become unlivable or unable to support their populations, migration will increase dramatically. If we handle this the way El Salvador and Honduras handled their crisis, we're facing catastrophic violence. Imagine hundreds of millions of climate refugees over the coming decades. Imagine the political tensions as they seek safety and opportunity. Imagine the nationalist politicians who will exploit these tensions. Imagine the violence that could result. This is not speculation. This is what the science predicts. And the football war shows us exactly what it looks like when resource scarcity drives migration, and migration drives conflict. The only way to prevent this nightmare scenario is to act now. Aggressively reduce carbon emissions to limit climate change. Invest in adaptation in vulnerable regions so people can stay in their homes. Create international legal frameworks for climate refugees. Build institutions that can manage large-scale migration humanely. Strengthen international cooperation. These are massive undertakings. They require unprecedented global coordination. They require overcoming nationalist politics and short-term thinking. But they're necessary. The alternative is a world of constant climate-driven conflicts, walls and camps and violence. The football war multiplied across continents. Fifth, the failure of international institutions. The United Nations is more developed than the OAS was in 1969, but it faces similar limitations. It depends on member states cooperating. It can't force powerful countries to do anything. It's chronically underfunded. It's slow to act. We see this in Syria, where years of civil war have killed hundreds of thousands while the international community watches. In Yemen, where a humanitarian catastrophe unfolds with minimal intervention. In Myanmar, where genocide occurred despite warning signs. The UN and other international institutions can do important work: peacekeeping, humanitarian aid, mediation. But they can't prevent determined actors from committing violence. This needs to change. We need to strengthen international institutions, give them more resources, more authority, faster decision-making mechanisms, greater ability to intervene early in escalating conflicts. This means powerful countries have to cede some sovereignty. They have to accept that international bodies can constrain their actions. This is politically difficult, but it's necessary if we want to prevent conflicts rather than just respond to them after thousands are dead. Sixth, the same dynamics within countries. The football war was an interstate conflict, but the same mechanisms that drove it operate within countries: polarization, dehumanization of political opponents, media manipulation, leaders exploiting divisions for political gain, institutional weakening. These dynamics are visible in many democracies today. In the United States, political polarization has reached levels not seen since the Civil War era. Each side views the other not as fellow citizens with different views, but as existential threats. Media on both sides spread fear and anger. Politicians benefit from this division because they can mobilize their base through hatred of the other side. Institutions are weakened as each side refuses to accept legitimate losses. This is dangerous. Democracies can collapse. They can slide into authoritarianism or civil conflict. It's happened before. It can happen again. The warning signs are the same: dehumanizing rhetoric, political violence being normalized, refusal to accept election results, attempts to undermine independent institutions. These are the patterns that precede democratic breakdown. The football war shows us where escalation leads. Once violence starts, once the permission structure for violence is established, it's very difficult to reverse. Better to recognize the warning signs early and act to de-escalate before we reach the point of no return. Part 12. Lessons and Conclusion. So what have we learned from this long journey through the football war? What are the lessons we should take away? Let me summarize the key points. First, triggers are not causes. The soccer matches did not cause the football war. They were the spark that ignited tensions built over decades. When someone tells you a conflict is about some specific incident, look deeper. Look for the structural factors, the economic pressures, the political dynamics, the historical grievances. Understanding root causes is essential for preventing and resolving conflicts. Second, leaders matter. The decisions made by Sanchez Hernandez and López Arellano, their choice to exploit nationalist fervor rather than calm it, their willingness to use violence for political gain, these choices had catastrophic consequences. Leadership is about making hard decisions that serve long-term collective interests, even when short-term political incentives point elsewhere. We need to demand this kind of leadership, and when leaders fail to provide it, when they exploit divisions and inflame tensions, we need to recognize this and refuse to follow them down paths that lead to violence. Third, media has enormous power and responsibility. Media can inform or manipulate. It can unite or divide. It can calm tensions or inflame them. In the football war, media in both countries chose to inflame. They published atrocity stories without verification. They amplified nationalist rhetoric. They helped prepare populations for war. Today's media environment is even more powerful and potentially more dangerous. We need media literacy. We need to question what we read and watch. We need to seek diverse sources. We need to be skeptical of emotionally manipulative content. And journalists need to remember their responsibility. Clicks and ratings matter for business, but truth and social stability matter more. Fourth, vulnerable populations need protection. The Salvadoran immigrants in Honduras were vulnerable because of their ambiguous legal status. When they became convenient scapegoats, there was nothing to protect them. This pattern repeats constantly. Immigrants, minorities, refugees, they're always the first targets when times get hard. We need strong legal frameworks that protect these populations. We need institutions that enforce those protections. We need political will to stand up for the vulnerable, even when it's politically costly. Because if we don't, if we allow vulnerable populations to be scapegoated and attacked, we're setting the stage for catastrophe. Fifth, prevention is cheaper and better than response. Everything about the football war could have been prevented. At multiple points, different choices would have averted catastrophe. But prevention is hard. It requires acting before crisis. It requires addressing root causes. It requires long-term thinking and sustained commitment. Response is easier politically. Wait until crisis hits, then act decisively. But response is far more costly in human terms. Thousands died in the football war. 100,000 became refugees. Decades of instability followed. All of this could have been prevented for a fraction of the cost. We need to invest in prevention, in early warning systems, in mediation and diplomacy, in addressing inequality and building institutions, in creating economic opportunity. This is the smart approach. It's also the moral approach. Sixth, war doesn't solve problems. This is perhaps the most important lesson. El Salvador went to war and gained nothing. Honduras defended itself and gained nothing. Both countries were worse off afterward. The underlying problems remained unresolved. War is not a solution. It's a failure. It's what happens when we lack the wisdom and courage to address problems peacefully. Yes, sometimes war is unavoidable. Sometimes you have to defend yourself against aggression. But the vast majority of wars, including the football war, could and should have been avoided. We need to remember this when leaders start beating war drums. When they tell us that conflict is necessary, that violence will solve our problems, we need to ask hard questions. What are the real interests being served? What are the alternatives? What will war actually accomplish? And what will it cost? Seventh, climate change makes everything worse. The football war was fundamentally about too many people and not enough land. Resource scarcity led to migration, which led to conflict. Climate change is going to create resource scarcity on a scale that dwarfs 1960s Central America. We're facing a future of massive climate-driven migration. How we handle this will determine whether the 21st century is defined by cooperation or conflict. We need to act now. Reduce emissions. Invest in adaptation. Build institutions for managing migration. Create legal frameworks for climate refugees. This is the challenge of our time. The football war shows us what happens when we fail. Eighth, history matters. We study the football war not just as historical curiosity, but as a way to understand our present and shape our future. The patterns that led to that conflict are still with us. The mechanisms that turned neighbors into enemies haven't disappeared. By understanding how the football war happened, by recognizing the warning signs and the decision points and the failures, we equip ourselves to prevent similar catastrophes today. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes. The details change, but the dynamics remain similar. Learn the patterns, recognize them when you see them, and act to break the cycle. And finally, individuals matter. It's easy to talk about wars in terms of governments and policies and abstract forces, but wars are experienced by individual human beings. People like Carlos, the farmer who lost everything, Maria, the teacher who was paralyzed, Lieutenant Roberto, who was destroyed by what he experienced. These were real people whose lives mattered. Every statistic, every number of dead or wounded or displaced represents individual human tragedies, families destroyed, dreams shattered, potential unrealized. When we make decisions about war and peace, about how we treat refugees, about how we respond to conflicts, we're making decisions about individual human lives, real people who will suffer or survive based on our choices. This should weigh heavily. This should make us choose wisely. Conclusion. The football war stands as a testament to human folly. 3,000 people died over a conflict that should never have happened. The soccer matches that gave the war its name were merely the spark. The real causes were structural: land inequality, population pressure, political failure, media manipulation, the exploitation of nationalist sentiment for political gain. At every point, the conflict could have been prevented. Different leadership, stronger institutions, international intervention, addressing root causes, any of these could have changed the outcome. But the necessary choices weren't made. Short-term political calculations trumped long-term collective interests, and thousands paid the price. The war solved nothing. El Salvador's land crisis continued. Honduras's economic problems continued. Both countries suffered from decades of instability. The refugees never recovered what they lost. The trauma echoed through generations, and the lessons were ignored. Central America continued to suffer through civil wars and violence. The same patterns repeated, the same failures, the same tragedies. But we can learn from this. We can recognize the warning signs when we see them in our own time. We can demand better leadership. We can resist media manipulation. We can protect vulnerable populations. We can invest in prevention. We can address root causes. We can choose peace over violence. These are hard choices. They require wisdom and courage and sustained commitment. But they're possible, and they're necessary. Because the alternative is more football wars, more conflicts driven by preventable causes, more lives destroyed, more human potential wasted, more cycles of violence perpetuating themselves. We can do better. We must do better. The victims of the football war deserve to be remembered, not just as statistics, not just as footnotes in history, but as human beings whose lives mattered, who suffered because of choices made by others, who died for causes that didn't have to lead to war. Their memory should motivate us, should remind us of the cost of failure, should inspire us to make better choices. 3,000 people died in the football war. Let's honor their memory by learning from their tragedy, by recognizing the patterns that led to their deaths, by acting to prevent those patterns from repeating, by building a world where soccer games are just soccer games, where refugees are protected, where conflicts are resolved peacefully, where human life is valued above political expediency, where leaders lead with wisdom rather than exploit divisions, where we recognize each other as fellow humans rather than enemies. This is the lesson of the football war. Not that it happened, but that it didn't have to, and that we can prevent the next one if we have the wisdom and courage to act. The choice is ours. The stakes are measured in human lives. Let's choose wisely.